that's kind of the mission. It's not to take the elite power lifter from a 600-pound squat to a 700-pound squat. That's not what our aim is. Our aim is to take as many people as possible who are not strong and have never been strong and make them strong. Not elite level strong, because that in a lot of ways is determined by genetics and a lot of other things. But, you know, I mean, we feel like just about, every guy, every semi-athletic committed guy, on the planet, ought to be able to say squat 315 and deadlift 405.
Welcome back, team, to another week here at Bobs and Mo's with Drew and Alex. I won't say the episode number, although I think we're getting close to 750 or
Something
so.
like that.
Um, this week we have one of my personal favorites, big name in the game for the strength and conditioning coaches out there. Um, Alex, who are we talking to?
It feels a little bit weird for me to be introducing him,
It is. I
given
thought
that
about I thought about this, but you've been doing it, so I thought, just do it.
I'm the default bio guy. I get it,
hmm
but this time it feels awkward because this episode
Good cop, bad
mostly
cop.
exists because Drew has a crush on our guest.
Yeah,
Um,
man crush.
yeah, and I didn't even realize how far back it was until we got into the conversation. He remembered
Way back.
emails from you from years ago.
Way back, yeah.
So Andy Baker began his career in strength and conditioning in 2001 as an intern while attending Texas A&M. Like many people in the early 2000s, he witnessed 9/11 and thought that exercise science lecture rooms might not be exactly where he needed to be. You'll hear it in the conversation today. He thought some of the classes were a little bit boring, justifiably. So in 2003, he stepped away from college and enlisted in the Marine Corps. He served multiple combat tours in Iraq between 2003 and 2007. And while serving on active duty, he continued to coach clients and finished his undergraduate degree in health and sports science from American Military University. After getting out in 2007, he opened the doors to Kingwood Strength and Conditioning, which is recently rebranded to Baker Personal Training. And he has served as the owner and lead trainer there for the past 16 years. His clients range from Division I collegiate athletes to people in their 80s. As you'll hear in the episode, he's been extensively involved in starting strength, working with Mark Ripito, including co-authoring the current edition of Practical Programming for Strength Training. I think a lot of coaches listening to this probably have that on their shelf somewhere, as well as the Barbell prescription. He has also competed as a raw and drug-free powerlifter with the Natural Athlete Strength Association. People out there know there's a lot of different powerlifting federations with different rules and things like that. I just think it's fun that the Natural Athlete Strength Association is abbreviated NASA.
I hope that was on purpose.
I mean, you gotta assume so. In
I heard this.
2010,
I heard their competitions are out of this world, though.
Drew is always good for a pun.
Hey,
In 2010, Andy won the NASA Grand Nationals in the 198-pound raw division with a 529-pound squat, a 380-pound bench press, and a 562-pound deadlift. You do have to wonder, though, if the NASA athletes compete on the moon. I don't know how that affects the
well,
difficulty
you
of those
just
lifts.
gave the location of the competition.
Ah, I got it.
It
Okay.
was
See,
on Earth. See, that's
mm,
the difference in you and me. My pun was funny.
I mean, I'm
Yours
just
was just
saying, if we got to convert for different gravity, that
fair.
might not be as impressive as it sounds.
No, you're right, but you gave the location. It was on Earth,
Did I?
didn't you?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a pretty safe assumption that it was probably on Earth, but it's NASA, so you never know.
God, this has become a rabbit hole,
Anyway,
a black hole.
one note before we get to the real episode. We did not work it into today's discussion, but his rebrand from a strength and conditioning facility to a personal training facility has also included a refocus on older adults and strength training for longevity and maintaining independence in older age and things like that. That's what the Barbell prescription book is all about. As that space grows, Andy has definitely made some really important contributions to that expanding part of the fitness industry. So if there's like material in that space you want to chase down, Andy might be your guy as well. But unfortunately, we found so much good material to talk about, kind of more focused on the younger tactical population, that we really didn't work the stuff he's doing recently with older clients into our conversation.
Yeah, you mentioned Man Crush for sure. As a young
Should we
strength
describe
coach,
his physique? We didn't really get to that.
He's 5'5", 220. I mean, I think
Yeah.
he's listening to this. He's like, Google him. He's got the biggest biceps you've ever seen. Thick. The kind of guy you would think he probably knows a little bit about barbell training.
Yep.
And so that's why we brought him on. Because as I was saying, when I was just getting into the game many moons ago, Starting Strength was one of those books that everybody seemed to have a copy of. And Starting Strength is great, but the one that I refer to more often than not was Practical Programming. Like you mentioned, I think of all the books I have, that is probably the most well-worn and arguably the most recommended, certainly for younger coaches, and I would argue for even athletes and or tactical athletes who just want to get a better grip on how to set up a training program that focuses on the basics of barbell lifting and the basics of getting strong. So that was kind of the genesis for bringing Andy on board. The fact that he was in the Marine Corps and can speak to some of the realities of training on active duty and on deployment, I think just adds a little bit of extra flavor to the conversation. So, as you mentioned, there are frontiers that Andy is expanded into that we did not cover on this episode. We will probably cover on future episodes. But if you guys want a good long conversation about how to get strong, you've come to the right place.
You just work long and strong.
Did I?
Long conversation about how to get strong.
Look at that. Man, you know what? You don't plan for these things and then they just happen.
Enjoy, guys.
So I wanted to ask you this because I could not tell you where I first heard you tell this story. It was on a podcast years ago. But I think it was a discussion about you doing some barbell training on a deployment or something like that, and you had set up like a squat rack on cinder blocks or something to that effect. And I was just curious, like when you were in the Marine Corps, what was driving you to pursue like strength training to the degree that you were? Because it seems like that was something that you were very passionate about, but then like we were just saying at the time, sort of the requirements you were being held to with the PT test and that sort of stuff was not strength based.
Yeah, well, I mean, I enlisted in the Marine Corps when I was 21. So slightly older than, like a lot of the people that I went into boot camp with. A lot of the guys were, 17, 18. So even when you're like 21, you feel like kind of an older guy in there. So and I started lifting, pretty, I guess, seriously by the time I was like 14. So, I mean, by the time I joined, I had already been training for, it's like lifting was a part of my life when I was, by the time, for 7 years before I enlisted. So it was always just something that I did extremely passionately. So, yeah, I mean, I just carried that with me wherever I went. So, including deployment, if there was access to barbells or whatever. I mean, I found what it to be. I mean, one, I didn't want to lose, we were deployed, I think the first time for like 8 months. So the thought of like not lifting for 8 months was like almost scarier to me than like getting shot at, so but I also found that while I was there, and this wasn't my intention was just to maintain my strength and muscle mass. But while I was there, I found it to be a tremendous stress reliever, in between patrols and stuff like that. When we got a few hours of downtime to walk over to the, whatever the hell it was called, we had a name for it. I don't know, but it was a gym. But of course, the military, they don't call it that. It's called something else. But I think all the equipment was donated by the USO, at the time. So we actually had pretty good stuff. But it was in a tent, in the middle of Iraq that was, 130 degrees or something. It had like a fan or something. But, it was even that, that was like kind of my escape, briefly or whatever from between patrols and stuff like that. Cause it's a pretty hairy environment we were in. So if I could go in there and get an hour long workout or whatever, I think it kept me level.
Did you find, and I ask this because with the population that I'm around, there are a handful of folks that are super strong. They seem to just kind of purely do barbell type work, which is fine. But being in the military, you have obviously your job requirements, you have your PT tests, there's an endurance component. How did you balance all of that? Or did you find that your pursuit of strength conflicted with any of that?
No, because like when I mean, I was very, like when I was in really, really good shape when I enlisted. And I was like, you know, now I'm like 220, but at the time, and I'm 5'5". At the time I was like 190 with, no body fat. And so I remember when I got to boot camp, like my first test, I did like 27 strict pull-ups. So, and I could run. I was in very, very good shape when I got there. So no, I did great on my initial PFTs when I first got there. And so, I could run and I could do the pull-ups. So the Marine Corps PFT at the time was pretty easy. I mean, 3 mile run, 20 pull-ups was a perfect score and like 100 sit-ups or whatever. So no, it was, I mean, in terms of balancing it, like, when we were in country, we didn't do a lot of running, but when you're back home, like in garrison, the only thing was like, PT, of course, is always in the morning, and I usually lifted at night. You're kind of worried sometimes about like those heavy lower body days because you didn't really know what you were going to be doing the next morning. And it might be an easy short run, or it might be some bullshit calisthenics or something, but it may be, the captain comes out and wants to take you on an 8 or 10 mile run or something. And you're like, so you're a little like, man, I'm not sure if I really want to like kill myself on this squat and deadlift workout tonight, because I might have to wake up in like, 6 or 8 hours from now and go on a long ass run. So, but you just kind of deal with it. It's not that wasn't harder than like coming home from the bar at 3 or 4 a.m. and going on a run at 6 a.m. So it wasn't that bad. But no, I balanced the lifting with the PT and stuff. The thing is too is, when I was at the time that I was in, I mean, the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, but the Iraq war was really, really hot at the time. So I mean, we were either deployed or we were training. There wasn't a lot of like downtime, like garrison time. So like it's probably, I think PT is probably, it's probably harder when you have like extended long times like in garrison, you know what I mean? But at the time it was like we were just busy like doing either actually deployed or doing training ops getting ready for deployment. So there wasn't, when I was in the like, in the fleet, it wasn't that the PT was not ever really that excessive.
Mhm.
So this isn't the question I'm going to ask you. I just want to address the irony because I think it's very real, and a lot of people will agree with the idea of like too much time in garrison getting in the way of being fit and doing your job. Like we need a good war to keep people focused on what's going on. Um, that's a conversation for another
Well, the
day. What
Army's
I'm
on its like fourth uniform change now, isn't it?
Don't worry about it, man. What I'm curious about here, because we have a very mixed audience that listens to the podcast. Some people are already human performance professionals, but a lot of the people that are listening to this are just military service members who are interested in fitness.
Right.
And I'm just curious about the timeline for you. So, as I understand it, you were already going to college. You already knew you were going to do strength and conditioning, had done some internship. Then you joined the Marine Corps, finished
Yeah.
your degree, got out, and dove all the way into the industry at that point. I'm curious, like, one, where did joining the Marine Corps come from? And two, what did the transition to getting back to the industry you knew you were interested in look like?
Well, so yeah, I was at Texas A&M, and I was majoring in exercise science there. To be honest, I was a little bored with it. It's not, because when you get into the exercise science field, like when you're a meathead like me, when you're into bodybuilding and powerlifting and stuff, like you're thinking like day one, that's what you're going to do is like be in the weight room working with like the football team or whatever, and that's, you're by and large working with a lot of nerds talking about the mitochondria and, all, and it's like, and it's like so you are a little bored as like a 18, 19-year-old or whatever. And, but so A&M, two things happened. One, for those that don't know, A&M has like, it's not like, West Point or whatever, where it's like a fully, but there is like that ROTC component. So there's
Mhm.
there's a lot of military guys that are at A&M. So there's a lot of guys that are preparing to go into active duty that are in the Corps of Cadets there at A&M. So there's a large military presence. There's also a lot of active duty guys there that are doing, I forgot the name of the program, but it's basically where enlisted guys go to college on the government's dime for like 4 years or whatever, and then they come out and go to officer candidate school, and they owe that time back to the military, but it's all paid for. So you had a lot of like guys that are getting ready to go into the military, and you have a lot of guys that actually are active duty, but are going to college at the time. So there was a big military influence there. And I knew a lot of those guys because I was working at a bar at the time as a bouncer, and there was a lot of military guys that were also working there with me. So I had never considered going into the military, but just being around all those guys and kind of, talking to them, very impressionable when you're 18, 19, 20 years old, kind of full of testosterone. And you're kind of around that, listening to they're, of course, they're telling you how great it is and all this kind of stuff. So that kind of got the gears turning in my head a little bit about, possibly going into the military. But at that time, I still had my sights set on, finishing my degree and that sort of thing. But then 9/11 hit, and that was like my sophomore year, I guess. And then it just, kind of like a lot of guys at the time, kind of the whole, patriotic, nationalistic fervor kind of hit. And then I think so it was kind of the influence of those three things, of being a little bit bored, the influence of 9/11, and being around a lot of military guys, at A&M who had some influence. And so, my parents, of course, weren't thrilled that, like, in the middle of my junior year, I'm like, hey, I'm going to take a little break and go join the Marine Corps right in the middle of a war, And so, but that was what I wanted to do. And then, during the course of that, 2 or 3 years went by, and kind of make the decision, are you going to stay in or get out or whatever? I didn't have that much college credits left that I needed to get. So I started working, on my degree again, time on ship. It's all paid for by the military. So it's a great thing. So I knocked out as many courses as I could, and finished while I was in, and then was able to, I'm self-employed now, so didn't necessarily need to do that, but I do have that, kind of check in the box of having finished the degree. So kind of came full circle with a little, 4-year hiatus there of a 4-year enlistment, kind of in the middle of that, but wound up back where I started in the exercise science, strength and conditioning world, if you will.
Were you, when that was going on, like, just as like a, you know, long time listener, first time caller, like following your work for as long as I have, when did you start getting involved with the starting strength world and testing out some of the things that you ended up writing about in that book and then the practical program? Like, was that in conjunction with your more, like, I guess, academic pursuits, or was that something you were kind of doing on the side as a hobbyist, if that makes sense?
My involvement with starting strength, and specifically Mark Ripito, it just kind of by happenstance. When I was 2006, 2007, so kind of towards the end of my enlistment, this weird thing was just kind of, getting known in the military, this little thing called CrossFit, that nobody knew what it was, but it kind of popped up in the military world probably a little bit before it showed up kind of in the general population world. And so there was a huge buzz about it, and nobody really understood it. It was like, hey, there's this website you can go to, and they post these workouts like every day, and there's all these like really jacked fit guys on there or whatever. And so I, of course, as someone who's just interested in all things strength and conditioning, I'm interested in all of it. It was so new and so novel. So of course I'm kind of paying attention, to the CrossFit stuff, dabbling in some of the workouts myself, and just watching other guys doing it, and checking on the CrossFit.com website all the time, looking at it. But it was very new and very novel. And part of the reason it gained so much popularity is because people don't, if you rewind back to the early 2000s, the whole fitness paradigm was bodybuilding related. The powerlifting was such a niche thing. The internet was not real big at the time. All of powerlifting at the time was all done in gear. So it was all bench shirts, squat suits, that kind of, there was no raw powerlifting. And it was just not a sport that a lot of people really were interested in. People weren't interested in wedging themselves into squat suits and bench shirts and 10-foot long knee wraps and, doing 1,000-pound quarter squats. And that's kind of what powerlifting was at the time. So it was very, very niche. Olympic weightlifting was even more niche. Nobody paid attention to Olympic weightlifting, but CrossFit single-handedly brought both raw powerlifting and Olympic lifting into kind of out of obscurity. People don't realize that. People think of CrossFit as just CrossFit and people running around doing weird shit, but that CrossFit single-handedly brought those two barbell sports out of obscurity and into the general public, because part of CrossFit was the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, and obviously the Olympic lifts. So as more people got into CrossFit, more people realized that, hey, one of the ways I can get really, really good at CrossFit is getting way better at these barbell lifts. Because if you're not good at the clean and jerk and the snatch, you're not going to do good on a lot of the WODs. And if you're not strong on like the squat, bench, and the deadlift, you're not going to CrossFit as well. So more and more people started training those. And then, as people kind of gained interest, specifically in the barbell lifting, then more people started going to powerlifting meets, but they weren't real interested in the geared stuff. So there was more participation in raw lifting. And then what CrossFit was doing is they were bringing in these subject matter experts to talk about, and there, like, you can go way back, and there was like a jump rope guy, and there was like a running guy. And then they brought in like Mike Bergener. He was the Olympic lifting guy. And then they brought in Mark Ripito as the subject matter expert on barbell training. Now, Mark had already written Starting Strength, but it was an obscure text, a book that not a lot of people knew about. Again, the internet was not as big as it was. There was no Amazon at the time. So he had self-published this book. And his whole goal with the book originally was to get it in front of like high school coaches. He wanted to get like the old school traditional barbell lifts like into the high school programs and coached well and that sort of thing. So Mark had been operating by himself in Wichita Falls for, several decades. And then he published this book with kind of everything he knew in terms of the technique of the barbell lifts and how to program them for a novice and all that kind of stuff. And this was my first exposure to like for people who aren't familiar, like Rip's really, really thorough analysis of like how to do a squat, how to do a deadlift, programming for a novice. That's no one had ever delved into it as deeply as he had, with as much thought and analysis. So like immediately, and I was more of a strength guy. I wasn't really interested in all the running and rope climbing like elements of CrossFit. So I was like really, really drawn to Rip's material as a subject matter expert as part of CrossFit. And being that we're both from Texas, there was kind of a connection there. And so I just started communicating with him, via email and via a forum that he was a moderator on. He was a guest moderator on a forum. Again, this is back in the day before social media was what it is now. All the meatheads were on forums back then. And this was a forum called strengthmill.net. And he was a guest moderator on there. And there's like 5 people that went to this forum. So there wasn't a lot of traffic. And me and him got to really talking there. And I started, just asking him questions and implementing his stuff into my own training and all that kind of, and we just kind of struck up a friendship. And then when I got out of the Marine Corps and I opened my gym in 2007, other than him, I was at the time, at least the only one that he knew about. I was the only one really putting his programming and stuff into practice with a large number of people in the private sector. Because before that, it was just him operating out of Wichita Falls and telling everybody, look what I've done here and look how great this is. Well, then it's like anything else. You do it with he's doing it with a few dozen, 100 people or whatever. And then I start doing it with more people. You learn more about a program or strategies or tactics. The more people do it, the more you learn about it. So I was putting all of his programming stuff into practice with regular people. And during all of this, me and him are communicating back and forth about what I'm seeing, what I'm learning, problems that I had coaching it, problems that I had programming it, and we both I was learning more from him at the time than he was from me, but he has it's one of the first, I think it's in the intro of his book, and it's he has a line in there. It's when one teaches, 2 people learn. And so he was helping walk me through a lot of this stuff and helping develop me as a coach and a programmer and a tactician in terms of how to coach these lifts technically. And through my feedback, he's probably learning a little bit too. And And so that's kind of how our friendship struck up. And we just, as starting strength grew, mainly via CrossFit as the vehicle that really allowed starting strength to grow. We kind of grew together, and then eventually, when he wanted to do another edition of Practical Programming, which is the kind of the second book in the there's starting strength and then there's practical programming. He said he contacted me and wanted me to co-author it with him, because he felt like I had something to contribute to that other than just him.
So I foresee a couple sections coming up in here, and I want to speak directly to the audience for a second and underline how great that, like, getting us up to speed on the history of the fitness industry.
I'm over here just like, I love that shit.
Drew's eating it up. He loves it. Between the two of us here, Drew is the meathead who's going to talk more programming with you, I think. I'm going to serve as like the advocate for the audience, and maybe we're going to back up just one step before Drew asks you a bunch of programming questions. And for those that don't have the text we keep referencing here, starting strength and practical programming, what, like, if you had to, I know this is like a bigger question than I think it is, but if you had to explain in simple terms what starting strength is, how would you do that?
Starting strength is, and it's really the only thing of its kind that I know of. It was certainly probably first of a detailed technical analysis of how to do the lifts. And by the lifts, we're talking about the basic barbell exercises, the squat, the bench press, the deadlift, the standing overhead press, and the power clean. Those are the kind of the big five barbell exercises that are outlined in that book. And Rip's whole thing was he wanted to, and I call him Rip. That's Mark Ripito for you guys that don't know. He goes by Rip. But Rip's whole thing is he always has said, I didn't just want this to be my opinion, which is how the barbell exercises were often taught by people. It was just, hey, look, I'm really strong. This is how I squat, so this is how I'm going to teach it. And that's not always the technically correct way to teach something. He wanted a detailed mechanical analysis based on anatomy and biomechanics and physics as a way to defend his position of these are the correct way to do these exercises. Because and he brought in guys like Steve Hill, who was an engineer that worked for, I want to say Delta, but a very, very intelligent guy and a mechanical engineer, to help him just like work out the physics of the lift. Like, it's, our body is a system of levers, right? And so there is a right and a wrong way to position a system of levers underneath a very heavy load and move it most efficiently. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of opinion on how you set up a crane to pick up a heavy object off the ground and move it to point A to point B. Like, there's a way dictated by physics that is correct and incorrect. It's not just whoever's in charge has an opinion and that's the way that you do it. And that's the level of analysis that he wanted. And so he applied that, the kind of the melding of the physiology and the anatomy and the physics as a model for how to do these lifts and how to coach them. And then the real genius part is taking that and distilling it down into a very, very simple teaching method. Because you're not going to get up when you're teaching a lift to somebody in the gym, you're not going to get up there and do a physics diagram and talk about the difference between, classes of levers and all this kind of stuff. Your client doesn't have time for that, or your athlete that you're coaching. So how can you take all of that information and distill it down into a very simple method that you as a coach can either teach your client or your athlete quickly and get them under the bar in 5 or 10 minutes and more or less doing a correct squat on day one for somebody that's never done it? Or if you're training yourself, how do you train yourself? Where do I put the bar? Where do I put my feet? How do I initiate the squat when I go down? Do I push my butt back or my knees forward? Where do I look with my head? How do I come up? Do I lead up with my hips or my chest? Like, those are all questions that he wanted to answer. And up to this point, nobody had ever given an analysis of the lifts at that level. So that's in a nutshell, that's starting strength. And then along with that is what we call the novice program in starting strength, which is what type of program. And that's how many days per week, what exercises on each day, how many sets and reps. How do that's what programming is basically kind of taking all those there's how to do the lifts and there's how to progress the lifts. How do I get from an empty 45-pound bar on day one to a 315 squat 6 months from now. That's programming. And so there's a simple novice linear, and that was his thing, is like most novices do not need a very complex program. They don't, and that's what a lot of this stuff was guys like me. You're subscribed to Powerlifting USA and you're just flipping to the back of the magazine and getting whatever this month's program is out of the back. But a lot of that stuff is designed for more advanced guys. That's for guys that are squatting 600 and doing 700, trying to get to 700. It's like that level of complexity is not necessary for a 40-year-old dude that's never put a bar on his back before and just wants to get generally stronger. So he posited not just how to do the lifts, but how to program them as a beginner to get strong in the most efficient way possible. Practical programming is kind of I guess we'll call it the sequel to that. Practical programming does not have any technical analysis of how to do the lifts, but it's like the longer term programming side of things. So the starting strength novice programming is really meant to last for about 3 to 6 months. So it's like kind of your beginner phase. Practical programming is, okay, what are you doing as an intermediate level lifter? How do you, what are you doing as an advanced lifter? That sort of thing. It's how to, how to think critically about the programming side of things to get continued progression. Because what will work for you as a novice in your third month of training is not going to work for you in your second year of training. And what you're doing in your second year of training probably won't work for you in your 10th year of training. So it becomes a little bit more complex as you get stronger and stronger and stronger over time. So it was just kind of our thoughts. And that's where I came in, was on practical programming. And he just, Rip one, he'll tell you he's not that interested in programming where I am. I'm an extreme nerd on that. I always have been. He's not that interested in it. And he just felt like I had some good insight that maybe he didn't, into the programming side of things. So we kind of did that. We did that book, kind of together. And so that's part 1 and 2. And then the third book we did was called The Barbell Prescription, which is kind of a combination of starting strength and practical programming. It's got elements of both in there, but it's written for the older population, for people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. So probably not a big part of this demographic, but that's kind of, there's 3 main books in the kind of the canon of starting strength. So
I think so. I personally do have some questions about barbell prescription, but I'm going to save those for later in the conversation. I think they do have some relevance to this audience, actually. We'll see. But I know Drew wants to dig in a little bit on some of the like practical programming type of stuff, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to say, just for the audience's sake, there's a ton of information out there in the space, right? Like you can be a big fan of Ripito or not a fan of Ripito, and like prefer different books over others and things like that. But for specifically the military audience, where you've got like sergeants who might not be super into lifting, but want to teach people how to train safely and how to do some of these foundational movements safely, it's the intro, like 5-step process to teach somebody how to deadlift from starting strength is a fantastic place to start.
right.
Like you can get more complicated if you want to down the road, but just in terms of like I don't know, by the numbers style, very army style or very military style way of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. Cool, you're doing a deadlift. I think it's kind of a go-to resource for that kind of thing.
People that are wired, and this is most like military officers, people that are very type A, we draw in a lot of like engineering type brain guys, because the models and all that type of stuff is very, very appealing to a person that thinks that way. See, I'm the opposite. I'm not very type A. I'm more of the I've come from a family of like artists and stuff. So I'm not like that. So I'm less interested in all that. I mean, I recognize the value of it and I still ascribe to it. But if you have people that are very, very interested in a detailed analytical model of something, and they don't want to just take somebody's word for it, they will be drawn to starting strength. So we recruit a lot of people that are wired that way. And I mean, I can see, because like you said, it's just like in the military where everything is, so basically paint by numbers by the book. Starting strength in a lot of ways is the same.
Do you like, again, I think starting strength was kind of my entry point to barbell training, and then practical programming like defined my thinking for a number of years. And I'm curious because of how many people you've worked with now and how much time has passed since that stuff came out. I know you obviously have your own website, your blog is very active. Do you still think that the kind of 5x5 linear progression, the bread and butter starting strength approach is the best way to introduce somebody to barbell training, or have you morphed some of your philosophy over the years?
No, it's still, I mean, with a novice, with a novice, somebody that's never lifted weights before, or who has never really done it seriously. Maybe they've come from doing a lot of machines and stuff like that, but somebody who's never really delved into barbell training, the squats, the bench, and the deadlift, and never really made a progressive effort to get stronger, that is, in my opinion, still the best place to start. If there is a better way to do it, there may be. It's just somebody hasn't posited it yet, that I've seen. So a lot of it, I would tell the critics of it, it's like, we'll come up with a faster, more efficient way to do it than that. And, that's the thing, is nobody's really put the effort into it that Rip has to come up with a model, not just of how to do the lifts, but how to program them as a novice. And that's like Rip's his focus is on novices, because I mean, he'll tell you, I don't care what the guy that's trying to get from 500 to 600 on a squat. I don't really care what he's doing, because that's not who we work with. And that's true as a coach in private practice, or even as a coach that works with athletes. And that's a big mistake that like a lot of coaches make in sports, is they take what is an elite athlete and put them on an advanced strength training type of program. But the mistake that they're making is, even an elite athlete may be a novice in terms of strength training. If they've never been exposed to it, something very, very simple and basic, like squat for 3 sets of 5, and the next workout, just add 5 pounds, and just do that for 3 to 6 months until you can't do it anymore. It doesn't need to be more complex than that. It doesn't matter if that kid is a scrawny, unathletic 15-year-old at the high school level, or if he's a Division I, athlete at Alabama. Like it doesn't necessarily matter, just because the level of athleticism, of genetic athleticism, is different, or like the level that they're playing at. It doesn't mean that they require more complex programming at all. And I think, like in y'all's world, like it would be the same thing. You may think that, well, you're working with some of these elite, tactical athletes or whatever, these special ops guys, but if they've never touched a barbell before, they're going to train on a novice program. That's where they're going to get the most bang for their buck, is on a very simple program that's going to get their lifts up the fastest. And that's, as what we do in our business, it's not, you're going to work with elite power lifters and stuff like that. And I do work with some of them, but that's not 90% of my business. That's a small percentage of the people that I work with. The vast majority of the people that I'm working with are coming in on day one, never having squatted before, or never having squatted correctly before. And we're starting them with, between 45 pounds, the empty bar, and maybe 135 for somebody who's got a little bit of a base of strength, and working and trying to work them up to like 315. And I think starting strength, and Mark Ripito and the community that he's created, probably been responsible for taking more people from basically 0 to 315 than any other organization of coaches in the world, and regular people, across all walks of life. And that's kind of the mission. It's not to take the elite power lifter from a 600-pound squat to a 700-pound squat. That's not what our aim is. Our aim is to take as many people as possible who are not strong and have never been strong, and make them strong, not elite level strong, because that in a lot of ways is determined by genetics and a lot of other things. But, we feel like just about, every guy, every semi-athletic committed guy, on the planet, ought to be able to say squat 315 and deadlift 405. Like, and you'd say that to some people, and it's like, well, that's crazy. It's not that crazy. It's not that crazy. And we all, as starting strength coaches, we all have lots of just regular people who are maybe 80% committed to the process, can get to that level. It takes work. Yeah, it definitely takes work, but like that's kind of our wheelhouse, is that area up there, like getting as many kind of just average people up to well above average levels of strength. Not necessarily elite level strength, because again, that's kind of a different ball game that has a lot of factors that you can't control in it. But and if I was working with military guys, that would be my that would be my outlook too. It's like, how many of you know, these regular infantry grunts can we get up to, a 315 squat? Because a large portion of them are able to do that. They physically are able to do that. They just don't know how, and there's nobody there to teach them. But it's definitely a reasonable goal to have, is something like that.
I remember, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I don't remember which text it was from, but it was something to the effect of like your rate of progression kind of determines novice, intermediate, advanced, not necessarily your overall training age. And that to me was kind of a key nugget because, again, at the time I was dealing with special operations types. You would think that these guys would be considered elite. They can do all these things, but if they have the ability to add whatever it is, 5 pounds a week and run that novice progression, they are effectively novices. They may not like being called that, but
Yes,
why create a really elaborate progression model if what it takes is literally just 5 pounds
adding
a
five,
week?
right, exactly. And that's the thing, is that and you were exactly right by that, is what, and we describe this in detail in practical programming, is what determines a novice versus an intermediate versus an advanced athlete is not how strong you are. Although there's going to be some similarities. Yeah, most advanced guys are going to be stronger than most novices. That's not the determining factor. The determining factor is, what rate of progression are you more or less capable of making on the squat? So like a lot of advanced powerlifting programs, guys that are really strong, that are preparing for a meet or whatever, they're looking at making a small PR on their lifts, maybe a 10-pound, 20-pound PR, at the end of every little 12-week program prior to their meet. Well, why would you follow, if you're a novice and you're capable of going up 5 to 10 pounds per week? Why would you follow this really elaborate program that doesn't ask you, it only asks you to set a 10-pound PR once every 3 months? You're capable of progressing it. So a program that has you only doing a 10-pound PR once every 12 weeks, the reason that is in place is because at that level of advancement, that's all those guys are capable of. A guy that's squatting 500 pounds typically cannot go in the gym and add 5 pounds per week to his squat like that. He's too advanced for that. Like he's too close to his genetic potential to make that rate of progress. So his progress he may only be capable of a 5 or 10 pound PR once every 12 weeks or 16 weeks or something like that. So he does need more elaborate programming. He has to accumulate a lot of stress over a long period of time in order to manifest a very small conservative PR. But a novice, some guy that's never lifted before or has only been lifting a few weeks, he can go into the gym on Wednesday, squat 135, and that could be the heaviest squat he's ever done. And then he can go back in 48 hours later, 72 hours later, and squat 140. And that's the heaviest squat he's ever done. And then he can go back in the following Monday and squat 145 or 150. So he's capable of going in 1, 2, 3 times a week on one of these lifts and adding 5 pounds every time he does it. So he's going up 5, 10, 15 pounds per week. And will be capable of doing that. And in our observation with doing this with hundreds, thousands of people now, is that will last anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And 6 months is really long. In some cases, it may only be 6 weeks. If a guy comes in does have some training background and is coming in like maybe already fairly strong or whatever, he may only get, say, 6 or 8 weeks of novice progression, but still, he'll still put a ton of weight on his lifts. A guy that starts off really, really skinny, like really, really underweight, but really commits to the eating part. And so it's the whole time he's progressing, he's also packing on quality body weight the whole time. He may be able to extend that process out 6 months. That I'd say the average is more like 3 to 4 months. But if you look at what is 3 to 4 months of going up in your squat 5 pounds 2 to 3 times per week, it's a significant amount of weight. It's the fastest progress you'll ever make is when you're unexposed to the stress. But the more that you do the lifts, the stronger that you get, and the more exposure you get to the lifts, the more desensitized you become to them. And so the less progress you're able to make. And so at that point, you're looking at, okay, maybe I can only go up and weight once a week. And now then, fast forward several months, several years. Okay, now I'm only going up and weight once a month, that sort of thing. And so we have models in there that kind of walk you through what that would look like how to train in a way that would have you manifesting progress only, once a week or once a month or something like that. But it also becomes at those more advanced stages, it becomes highly individualized. So there's not like the novice program pretty much works for everybody. Like you don't need a ton of modification. I mean, there are guys that we need to do some modifications for, but they're generally fairly minor. For the most part, the novice program as it's laid out kind of works for everybody. And then as you get more and more advanced, it becomes a much more individualized approach where, some guys will require a lot of volume, some guys won't require as much. And a lot of that is based on your genetics, your genetic predisposition to responding a certain way. It depends on how much weight you gain. There's lots of factors that go into it. But that's it in a nutshell, is why follow a really, an advanced program does not mean better. It means slower, and it's slower by necessity, not because slower is necessarily better. So that is in essence, the difference between a novice, intermediate, and advanced program is the rate of adaptation, which that athlete is capable of.
Does that calculus change when you start to introduce additional stressors? And the reason I ask that is because with this population, inevitably there will be some folks out there who lead PT or whatever, and they hear
the
this.
answer is yes. I already know what you're going to ask, and the answer is yes.
Right, and that's kind of like I'm curious because I think when you and I originally started talking years ago, I was asking questions about autoregulation and things like that, and ways to encapsulate the fact that people do have to run, they do have unit PT, blah 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 blah. So when I hear you talk about that kind of novice progression, I think the built-in assumption there is that these people are quote unquote maxing out every time, which I would assume imply that they have enough adaptation currency to do that over and over and over again. But if they did a 2-mile run the day before, that then changes the narrative. So
it does.
How do you factor for that?
Well, it makes it more difficult for sure. And we a lot of times we have what we call situational intermediates, which is when you have somebody that's in an environment, and they may, somebody that's new, that's running often, especially if they're pretty well adapted to running. If you have a guy that's already is used to running, let's just say 3 days a week, he's used to running three miles 3 days a week, maybe more, but we'll just use that as our example. If you put him on the novice program, he's still going to get some novice gains because he's pretty well adapted to the running. It probably won't be as long. He won't get that. He's not going to get that 4 to 6 month window. It might be between 6 and 12 weeks, but he's still going to put a significant amount on his lifts by running a novice progression. But if somebody is in the middle, let's say they haven't been running and they're in the middle of their novice progression, and all of a sudden you introduce a 2 and 3 mile run every couple of days, it's going to fuck it up because the running especially definitely interferes, particularly with the lower body training. It's going to interfere with the squat. It's going to interfere to a degree with the deadlift, less so on the upper body lifts. Aside from weight loss, if you start losing weight in the middle of your novice progression, you're going to go backwards. Novice progressions typically are going to work best on somebody who is actively gaining weight. And that doesn't apply to not every person that does a novice progression needs to gain weight, but I would say a lot of your military guys do. I mean, most of the guys I was in the infantry units with would have been better off 25, 30 pounds heavier. I mean, they were just young and skinny, and they would have been better suited to the job had they been bigger and stronger. But if you start losing weight during the middle of it, that's going to mess it up. So when that happens, when you have a situation where kind of a daily linear progression like that is not feasible because of the running and that sort of rucks and things like that, you become what's called a situational intermediate, which is you're switching over to intermediate level programming really before you should, but it's by necessity you have to. And it's not that big of a deal. It's not the end of the world. With athletes, it's the same thing as in the military. I mean, if you're training kids that play sports, which I do a lot of, I train some military guys, but I deal with a lot more probably athletes than I do, but it's the same thing. It's the same problem is how do you structure these strength training workouts around the practice and the play of their sport? And like with athletes, one of the considerations, it's not just are they going to be recovered for their workouts, but you don't want to necessarily, if you're training a kid that's a football player, you don't want to have them do a bunch of, 5x5 heavy squats the day before he has to go play a game, right? He's going to have, dead legs the next day, or a pitcher. You want him to be a baseball pitcher. You want him to be recovered from the lifting prior to his next start. It makes it easier. So the first thing I do when I work with an athlete, and this is one of the difference between an athlete and a tactical athlete, is when I work with an athlete, the first thing that I do is I figure out their competitive schedule. When are your practices? What are you doing in your practices? When are your hardest practices? When are your games, or when are your competitions? And then we're going to structure the training program around that to make sure that your hardest workouts are done when you're best recovered to do them, but also when they're going to have the least impact on your next competition. Because you got to look at it from both of those perspectives. With the military guys that I work with, and I think I referenced this kind of at the beginning of our podcast, is like what is ours wasn't very structured. Like when we ran and how long we ran, we didn't know. It depended on who led the PT the next morning, because it might be your lieutenant who is a running guy and wants to go on a super long run. It may be your captain comes out once in a blue moon and he wants to take the whole, the whole unit out for a super long 8 to 10 mile run with, obstacle course or who knows what. Or you may get a lazy NCO who just tells everybody, just go to the gym because we're all hungover still from the night before. Right. So you don't really know what your, what your PT might look like the next day. It's not all that structured. Now, maybe in the special ops community, maybe it is more structured. I don't know because I'm not in that world. But to the degree, if you have any agency in that, if you're an NCO or an officer or whatever who has some say so or some authority in how it is better to structure the week so that the athletes or the soldiers, the Marines or whoever can program in a way that makes some sense. And so that you're not asking them to do a 8-mile run and then the next day go do a 1 RM squat, right? So because it's not going to work. So you can balance the two, but it does have to be done intelligently. And when everything is at random, and you may have a short run, a no run, a long run, a ruck with heavy gear, like it does. You do have to then have a system in place where you auto regulate. A very good read for anybody is Bill Starr. And for those who aren't familiar, Bill Starr was an Olympic weightlifter and powerlifter. His heyday was back. I'll spare everybody the history.
The Strongest Shall Survive. I love that book.
Yeah. So it's an older book. Bill Starr was Mark Ripeto's coach and his mentor. So Mark Ripeto's material is very much built upon a foundation laid by Bill Starr. His book, which was written in the 70s, Bill Starr was a very good Olympic weightlifter and a very good power lifter. He was also, I believe he was the first strength and conditioning coach in the NFL. He was because at the time in the early 70s and stuff, that just wasn't a part of, NFL programs. If guys did it, they did it on their own or whatever. But he worked for the Baltimore Colts and then the Houston Oilers as a strength coach. And he worked with a lot of universities as well. And that book that he wrote was an effort, like Mark's book, was an effort to get into the collegiate programs and the high school programs with a structured barbell-based strength program. And his system that he uses is a heavy, light, medium system. So basically, it's like in his book, every workout is the squat, the bench press, and the power clean, which I would take exception with that and say that's not the best way to do it, but whatever. That it was good, it was fine for the time, and there's reasons he did it that way. And I've actually read his material where he said if he wasn't trying to make it commercially viable, he would have done it a different way. But that's what he did. It was the squat, the bench press, and the power clean. But it was so every workout was those three lifts, but it was based on a heavy, light, medium system, so that you had one heavy, very high stress workout, then you had a lighter workout, and then you had a medium workout, and you could plug those days into the athlete's competitive schedule to make. So maybe the light day was the day before the game, and the heavy day was the day after the game. So if like in a high school program, you play the game on Friday night, the best time to lift heavy is on Saturday because you have the whole week to kind of recover from that. You're not doing it. You're fresh. Games actually at the high school level typically aren't as hard as the practices are. And so you would have like a light and a medium day during the week because it's integrated along with the practices. So athletes are maybe fatigued or have to go to practice the next day after lifting, so they're not going in sore or whatever. But the point is if you have a structured conditioning program, like for your military guys, tactical level, if you have a more structured conditioning regimen, then you can figure out a way, like with a heavy, light, medium schedule, to plug in those workouts during the week in a way that makes sense, that will allow the athletes to both lift heavy in a recovered state, but also do their running and their conditioning in a recovered state. So you don't have the two things kind of at odds with each other. And so that's, a simple system like that would, I still use a heavy, light, medium system with a lot of kids that I work with, because it just works really well. You've got that one really hard, heavy workout, and then the other ones are kind of maintenance level stuff during the week. But that is needed at that level. Usually young athletes and or even your young military guys, they need the frequency of the, one heavy squat workout. It may not do it to make progress. They're going to need more frequent exposure to those lifts, but they can't go heavy every time. It either won't happen. Now, as the guys get more advanced, you get into programming with auto regulation, which is not something that novices or early on intermediate lifters are going to be very good at. So it's better to have a program that kind of auto regulates for them, that plugs in those light and medium days for them, rather than them just auto regulating, all on their own.
So I'm often guilty on this podcast of saying a bunch of stuff and not ending it with a question for the guest. And I'm about to do that right now. I just want to underline some things that Andy said in there that I think are useful to draw out a little bit and emphasize for this particular audience. And one is, this is just like circling around the conversation of how much running is a lot, how much running is enough, stuff like that, constant conversation in the Army. And Andy's probably not been part of these conversations necessarily, but a huge thing that has happened as we insert strength and conditioning coaches into the military is tons of debates about like, should we be doing a minimal running kind of situation? What is the minimum? Is more running okay? I don't know. I'm not really into that. I just do the weight room side. And the example Andy used was 3 miles 3 times a week. And I liked it as an example because it's a good starting point for a conversation of, is that a lot? And the answer is, it depends on what you're trained for right now. Like if I take a person who runs all the time and ask them, is 3-mile runs per week a lot? They're going to say no, like that's not that much. That's not going to bother me. There's no issue there. Probably not enough to be great even in your like local 5K or something. But if I ask somebody who doesn't run at all, is 3-mile runs a week a lot? They're going to say, absolutely, yeah, that would break me off. And we have both of those populations in the military in every unit. So if you just like throw a lieutenant up front who loves running and who thinks 3-mile runs a week is nothing, and have them run a platoon where half the platoon is not accustomed to that, we're running into both injury problems and the interference type stuff you're talking about, where they're not going to be able to progress strength because they're too fatigued, yada, yada, yada. I don't have like an answer to that, and there's no question there. I just think it's an important conversation that people don't have enough. And then getting nerdy for a second, because I've seen stuff about the 2-factor model of sports performance on starting strength before, and something that's been kicking around in my brain for a long time. And I've messaged a few folks about this and had these conversations, but a 2-factor model of tactical performance, because I think a couple things happen. I think coaches who come from a space, an athletics space, assume that a fair amount of conditioning is happening just by nature of doing practices, right? If you train soccer players, they're doing a fair amount of sports specific conditioning just by doing practice. If you train football players, you can assume something similar, and it's always going to be sports specific because the practice is the sport, yada, yada, yada. But in tactical, those things get blurrier and more confusing. Is a ruck march training or practice? I don't know, context dependent. Potentially, there's conditioning rucks where we're not worried about tactical movement. There are tactical rucks where we're more worried about the tactics than the actual conditioning. So we might not be pushing the pace to the limits physically. And you got a lot of places in the military where they're not spending enough time doing the practice component. So we try and make up for that with tactical PT, whatever you want to call that. I don't think we have space in this episode to do the kind of conversation I want to have on the two-factor model of tactical performance. But there's something there, like there's a useful model there that I think would be helpful to coaches that are trying to bridge the stuff they've learned from the sports world and the situation they're now in the tactical world.
Well, like you said, it's the problem is that in the military, there's in any sport, there's a defined competition that the length of the let's say whether it's so if it's a football player, a baseball player, or whatever, like the defining characteristics of the competition. You know how long a football game lasts by position. You know exactly what the demands are. Um, whether, and like I train, like what you said, I train a ton of swimmers. Like I don't waste time when I'm training swimmers. I do zero conditioning with them because they're in the pool twice a day, every day. Like I don't need like more conditioning on my part is just more of the same. So I'm strictly strength training them. It's heavy, slow lifting to make them stronger. But in the military, it's just so there's no defined, what is combat readiness? I mean, it, like you said, it
Mm-hmm.
depends. I mean, if you look at, whatever, go watch the movie Lone Survivor, and you see the guys, I don't know how accurate that is, but just for people who aren't familiar, those guys get stuck in a shitty situation and have to ruck their way out of there over what? I don't know,
Forever.
hundreds of miles, but a long fucking way over really rough terrain, carrying a lot of stuff. That's not the norm, but does a Navy SEAL or a Delta Force squad or whatever, might they find themselves in that position in a combat theater like Afghanistan? Yeah, they might, but how do you prepare for that? And does the entire military need to be prepared for that? I think part of going into Iraq probably taught us a lot in terms of urban warfare, most of which Iraq was. Being able to run 3 miles or 5 miles was irrelevant. And that, any time that my physical fitness was tested in that real world theater, that's the test is the actual, but every war is different. The veterans of Iraq had a different, probably a different. I never went to Afghanistan, so I don't really know, but I'm under the assumption that the physical needs of the theater in Iraq were different than some of the needs that you might have in Afghanistan, which were different from Vietnam. But I can only speak to my own personal experience in a combat theater in Iraq. But the ability to run 3 miles was irrelevant. The physical conditioning that we needed, and I was a machine gunner, so we had a lot of heavy gear, heavy boxes of ammo. The gun itself is heavy. Being strong was a much more useful adaptation than having an extreme endurance base because it just never asked to deploy an extreme endurance base. To the degree that we did, it was things like running up and down stairs to the top floor of a building 5 or 6 times with boxes of ammo. Now, do you have to be conditioned for that? Yeah, you do, but you also need to be strong. So like for something like that, how would I condition somebody? Well, I would get their legs really strong with say squats and deadlifts and grip strength and all that sort of thing. And then things like a 300-yard shuttle run, like very, very anaerobic type of activities, very high intensity, short duration, short rest time in between. You just think about that. Okay, we got 10 boxes of 50 cal ammo down in the truck, and we need to get the 50 cal plus all these boxes of ammo up to the roof now because we need to lay down suppressive fire. We need to do that as fast as possible. Well, I mean, you can pretty easily design a strength and conditioning protocol around that, just that specific demand. But that was just me and my unit. And that's, that's probably about the toughest thing we did in terms of physical, that we would need. But, in that case, long distance running in a pair of shorts and, with no gear on is almost irrelevant. But having a 400-pound deadlift and being able to run, 300-yard shuttles on a short duration rest would have been very useful for most people. So, you have to, that's where it comes into, and, the upper level military guys could speak better to this than me, but a thorough review of speaking to, NCOs and young officers, lieutenants and stuff that are actually on the ground and getting feedback of what exactly are the physical demands of the modern combat theater, and how do we design a strength and conditioning program around that. But then the problem is, who's to say what the next war is and what it's going to look like, what the actual theater is? Maybe there is more of a need for, more rucking or whatever, longer duration type stuff. So that's the problem with designing programming for the tactical athlete, is that the test, the game day, is largely unknown. But there's a guy out there in the fitness world, Mark Bell. He's got a great saying, and I say it to my people all the time: strength is never a weakness, and weakness is never a strength. So strength, I mean, it always helps to be stronger. There's never a situation where you can be too strong, or that not having more strength isn't going to help you. So the question is really, like you said, how much conditioning is too much, and also what type of conditioning is the most useful. I would posit that things like I've mentioned a couple times in here, a 300-yard shuttle run. That's a test that's used a lot in athletics as a baseline for conditioning. And basically what that is you set up cones, like at the, let's say on a football field, on the goal line and the 50-yard line. So you got a 50-yard course, and you're basically, you go down and back 3 times. So you're doing 6 legs of that. So, run to the end, run to the line, touch it, come back. It's, down and back, down and back, down and back. So 300 yards total. And you run the first one, and you have to complete it under a certain amount of time. So you can't sandbag the first one. And let's just say that the first, you have to complete it, like, let's say in a minute, 60 seconds or whatever. And then you get like a 1-minute break, and you run it again. And what's measured is the drop off. So if you get 60 seconds the first time and you get 65 the second time, that's pretty fucking good. Like, you rested
Did we discuss exactly that on the episode that's going to air right before this one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very timely advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, so like testing like that, like much more anaerobic.
Mm-hmm.
At least in my own experience from back in 2003, 4, 5, when I was in theater, that would have been a much more useful conditioning test than a long duration run. Or, something like you mentioned what the Army does now with like the carries and drags or whatever. I think the Marine Corps has something similar in their combat readiness test. I don't know exactly what they do, but they definitely recognized the need to introduce some load into the conditioning part of it, because that is almost always a precondition that you are not just moving, but you're moving with load.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a pack, you've got ammo, you've got your gun, you might have a different weapon. If you're a machine gunner like I was, you've got, not only do you have your rifle, but you've got, an entire squad-based weapon system that has to be transported up in multiple pieces, plus all the ammo that goes with that, plus just all the other shit that you carry with you. So, that's where, like, I think any really good conditioning element for a tactical athlete is going to have to, because a lot of these kids, some of the guys that were really good at running, they're small, they're 145 pounds or whatever, they could run for days. But you put a heavy pack on their back and make them ruck with a weapon system, they can't do it. Like, they break down under that. So that's where, looking at, okay, how valuable is it to have a bunch of very small, skinny, long distance runners versus some bigger guys that are still highly conditioned, but that can that can move and maintain their conditioning, but they can also do it with load, whether that's ammo and weapon systems, or whether that's a person that needs to be carried out of a theater that's wounded or whatever it is. Um, I think any relevant tactical conditioning protocol would have some element of load to it and not just running for distance.
And so speaking of tactical protocols, one of the things I know that you've kind of riffed on this a couple of times on your blog, certainly, but I know it gets asked pretty frequently here too, which is kind of minimal effective dose training or training when you don't have a lot of time. And so I'm curious your thoughts on like when somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, starting strength looks great, heavy, light, medium, it's all cool. I don't have a lot of time to do all of that." Like, where do you first look to start trimming some of that fat to get down to those like key pieces that you think need to be there, regardless of time?
Well, you look at what are the most important lifts, regardless of how you schedule them. And I think for most novices, or for anybody where strength is a priority, you're going to be looking at the squat, the deadlift, the bench press, and the overhead press, and I would throw probably pull-ups in there as well, because it works a section of muscle mass that those other lifts don't necessarily hit all that well. And so those would be like my big five. And then you just figure out how often, because like you said, the starting strength program is typically a full body workout. A typical workout would be 3 sets of squats, 3 sets of bench press, and then one heavy set of deadlifts. When somebody first starts out, sometimes you can knock that out in 40 minutes. It's not that, because they're not using very much weight. They don't have a lot of warm-up sets. There's not very much rest time in between sets. But as they get stronger, their ability to fatigue themselves increases. So they often will need a little bit more rest time in between sets. And strength training is not the area to do conditioning. And that's also a fundamental mistake that a lot of coaches make. I would rather have a guy do less in a workout, but take his time in between, because we're not training. We're not trying to make the strength workout a cardio session. We're training strength and we're training muscle mass. And this is a huge mistake that a lot of football coaches make, is they want to turn the weight room workout into a conditioning session. And all that does is cut down on the amount of weight that you can handle, which ultimately cuts down on the amount of strength that you can build and the amount of muscle that you can build. So rest time between sets, doing a set of squats and then sitting on your ass for 3 to 5 minutes that's not necessarily being lazy. That's what is required often for in order to build a significant amount of strength and muscle. So I would rather have the athlete do less in a workout, but do it right, rather than try to cram too much into a workout and then just move fast and go on 60 seconds of rest in between sets, because that's going to greatly limit your ability to do the amount of work that you need to do in order to really get strong and build muscle. So if someone's very time limited, if that means you squat once a week, you bench press once a week, you overhead press once a week, and you deadlift once a week, and so you have 4 training days, but they're all pretty short, and that's what you do, then that's what you do. And you can still make progress doing that, even if it's not optimal. So the reality is working with athletes and even working with the general public, where they're trying to just balance strength training with parenting and work and other hobbies, you're almost never operating in what you would consider an optimal environment. And so in the tactical world, I can guarantee you're almost never operating in what would be an optimal environment for strength training, which is why you probably don't see a whole lot of, regular Army and Marine Corps grunts with 500-pound squats and 600-pound deadlifts. They're never going to be in a position to do that. They're never going to be training in a way or eating in a way that's going to facilitate those types of gains. They're never going to have enough time with uninterrupted training that's not interrupted by 2 weeks out in the field or 2 weeks on ship or, whatever that's going to interrupt that. And that's a reality of military life, especially if you're in the infantry, is that you're gonna have constant interruptions where you're just literally not able to train. And so you just do what you can. But I'd rather have somebody go and just do a really good squat workout, and that's all that they do, but do it right, rather than try to cram squat, bench, deadlift, pull-ups all into one workout and speed rush through it. So there's kind of programming like 1 lift a day, or splitting things up into upper body, lower body. So you've got, twice a week you come in and just squat and deadlift, and then twice a week you come in and bench and overhead press and maybe some pull-ups or something like that. You split it up however you need to split it up. And really the gains come from it's not really the training. So whether a guy does a full body workout or upper lower, that's not really going to be the determining factor. What's going to be the determining factor is what lifts is he doing? How is he executing those lifts? Is he executing them properly? And then is he doing everything that he can to progress those lifts? So whether that's done in the context of full body workouts or upper lower or one lift a day or whatever, doesn't really matter that much. It's more about the quality of the exercises that you're choosing, the way that, executing them properly, and then trying to load them as often as possible, as is reasonably possible.
So I don't want to miss the opportunity here. I don't know if Drew explained the concept of MOPS and MOs to Andy before he came on the podcast. I kind of doubt it was in the email chain, but we just successfully stumbled our way into the concept again right there. And just to underline it, the amount of stuff you pack into a workout would be a measure of performance for that training session potentially. The results you get from it is a measure of effectiveness. So Andy just pointed out it doesn't matter how much stuff you do in the workout if it produces less results than you could have with a pared down workout with appropriate rest intervals and things like that. I just want to underline that. And then to go with that, just a reminder for the military population, and Andy's gotten after this several times in the conversation, that how much you squat, how much you bench, and how much you deadlift are not measures of effectiveness for the physical training you are doing if your goal is performance at like actual operational tasks and things like that. Those are steps towards it, and you might measure them as measures of performance, but a measure of effectiveness would have to be how those contribute to the performance and the things you're theoretically training for.
Right.
That's all. I'll hand it back to Drew to talk.
No, I think that's 100% correct. And I do some consulting with like high school football coaches and things like that, people that recognize that they're in a position where maybe they just got put in charge of a strength program at the high school level, and they don't have any sort of requisite background to really do that. And they may operate off of something that the head coach told them, here's what I want you to do, or they pick up where the last guy left off, or they read something online or whatever. And I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, you've got 60 kids in a busy weight room, and you've got 45 minutes, and you have like 9 exercises on here. Like that, like you would, and so they're hesitant to cut anything out because they have that mindset of the more we can pack into this 45-minute session, the more our athletes are going to get out of it. But the problem is it all just becomes watered down crap, and you're moving at a pace that is not conducive to strength and muscle building. And so, yeah, you're getting a lot of work done, and the kids are worn out and exhausted. And if that's your measure of an effective workout, is just how many exercises did we do, and are all the kids exhausted? But like you said, they're not getting any stronger, and they're not getting any bigger. And I think that 90% of high school strength programs would be better if they cut 90% of that shit out and had half the kids squat and the other half of the kids bench for 30 minutes and then blew the whistle and they switched. And the other half squatted and the other half benched, and they did that 3 days a week. And a lot of people, well, that's not it, but it's not optimal. And I would rather have them do more than that. But I would rather have a group of high school football players squat and bench correctly and get stronger on those 2 lifts to the exclusion of everything else than try to cram in 9 different exercises into a session and get progress on none of them, just so they can say that we did all these things. And I think in a lot of ways, a military situation may be similar, where, it would be better if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of time and you're trying to balance it off, pick 2 exercises and do them each twice a week, or, on Monday we squat and bench, and on Thursday we overhead press and deadlift, and then somewhere in between you throw in some chin ups and shit like that, like that, just that basic program: Monday squat bench, Thursday overhead press and deadlift. Like that right there could change the physicality of an entire platoon if you did that for 3 months and did it right and did it seriously, and everybody showed up and it was coached well and everybody progressed. The problem is the simplicity of an approach like that works against it. They look at it and they just look at it and they go, this isn't enough. It has to be more than this. It has to be more complex than squat, bench Monday, overhead press, deadlift Thursday, and just add 5 pounds each time you come in. But the reality is in terms of just a pure, is that going to get you into elite fitness? No. Will that get you stronger and add muscle mass? Yes, it will. And it will be better than what a lot of these guys are doing. And so it's not optimal, but but people read that, especially a leader of a platoon or something like that, that has, that ultimately holds some responsibility, may look at that just like a high school football coach would look at that and go, no way, there's no way that could work. It has to be more complex than that. And it really doesn't. And so, high school coaches are notoriously stubborn. Military guys are notoriously stubborn, and they're all set in their own ways. And, I know when I was in, it was starting to change a little bit, partly because, again, the impact of CrossFit, where there was, but when I was in the old guard, the guys that were the higher level, staff NCOs, the master sergeants, the first sergeants, the sergeant majors, the majors, the colonels, the lieutenant colonels, those, the kind of the old guard, it was all running all the time. A lot of the younger officers and younger, NCOs, a lot of them, I think, had a recognition that there was a need for something more than just running distance and doing Jack LaLanne style calisthenics out in the parking lot, and that was the worst. I mean, you're out there doing toe touches and, and it's like, what are we doing here? This is like 1940s level shit. I mean, it was fine for back then, but that was just the doctrine. And as you guys know, the military is not fast to change. It takes a long time for institutional change to occur. And so it takes a new generation of leadership and I'm sure it's there now, because it was already starting when I was getting out in like 2007 era.
Careful with the assumptions there.
Maybe not. Maybe
I
I'm wrong.
promise there are still platoons of people doing calisthenics in fields everywhere. I promise.
And if that's all, if you're
true.
out in and if you're out in the field and you're out in the field for 2 weeks on a training op, and that's, you don't have equipment out there with you, then that's what you do.
Get that Jack LaLanne stuff out.
Yeah. And it was just like, but that's kind of what, like, a lot of it was. And it's just, it took a while to get that stuff out of there, and update it. We have more technology. We have more knowledge now. Like you said, they're bringing in people from the outside. It's like they outsource so much other stuff to civilians. Why not the strength and conditioning as well? Why not bring in, they spend enough dumb money on other shit, they outsource our supply chain and our food and everything else to the civilian world. It's like, why not outsource that to some people that maybe could help, in that regard. So
I feel bad now asking this question because we just sort of talked about paring things down, and this maybe goes in the other direction, but kind of one of my kind of last questions on the programming side of the house. We get this a lot where the ACFT now for the Army has this hex bar deadlift. And so there's a subset of people who think, oh, I'll just do a bunch of hex bar deadlifts to get better at hex bar deadlifts. And I think that there's a conversation to be had about the importance of accessory work and kind of the movements that you would target around that, in addition to hex bar deadlifts, but not even just deadlifts specifically, but for improving those core lifts that you talked about. Like, what is your thought process on doing supplementary work, assuming there's time for it, assuming there's access to equipment, to kind of produce greater results for something like the ACFT and the hex bar deadlift?
Well, so, I mean, like a hex bar deadlift, so specifically on that lift, there's always a lot of controversy on like hex bar deadlifts or what we call trap bar deadlifts. It's the same thing. But, mechanically, a trap bar deadlift or a hex bar deadlift is closer to a squat than it is a deadlift, actually, than a barbell deadlift, just because of the way that the weight is positioned. So it's more like a deadlift in that the lift starts on the ground and it's held in your hands. But mechanically, what it actually is like a partial squat. So if you train a full range of motion squat, which will strengthen your legs better than a trap bar deadlift because of the range of motion is better. and you train a conventional barbell deadlift will strengthen your back much better. You can easily transition and do a heavy trap bar deadlift without actually training the trap bar deadlift. So would I rather have a guy doing trap bar deadlifts than no deadlifts at all? Yes, because it is a movement that can be loaded with heavy weight. But you don't necessarily have to train that directly to get good at it. There was kind of always like, here's I'll defend the trap bar deadlift in that it's very easy to coach. And a lot of sports programs, particularly football, use a trap bar deadlift. I think they will often justify it as being better, but the reality is it's easier to coach. It is not as technically a difficult lift as a deadlift with a barbell or a properly performed barbell squat. So in that regard, it has some benefits. That's not necessarily a drawback. If you're like in a high school weight room and you're one coach and you've got authority over 50 kids and you're allotted basically no time for teaching, which they don't. They typically go day one of the off season. It's all full speed ahead. You're probably going to get a larger majority of those kids doing correct trap bar deadlifts on day one than you would a regular barbell deadlift. So then you ask, is a properly executed trap bar deadlift better than a poorly executed barbell deadlift? And I would say yes, it's probably better to do the lesser exercise right than to do the better exercise wrong. So in that regard, the military would have a similar thing where you don't necessarily have expert coaching at hand. A trap bar deadlift can be fine because you're going to have a higher percentage of these guys, of the soldiers or Marines or whatever, doing it correctly early on than you will if you taught them the barbell stuff. Now, if I was there or any other competent coach, I would not be training them with the trap bar deadlift. I would be training them with a barbell deadlift and a barbell based squat. And then when it came time to test, I'd say, all right, go get out there and fucking wreck that trap bar because it'll be fairly easy to do. So it's not something that necessarily has to be trained. So there's pros and cons of it, right? Like mechanically, I think the barbell is a better tool, but in terms of just the practicality of implementation, there are some benefits to the trap bar. And I think it's infinitely better. The fact that they're trying to use some sort of very heavy implement as part of the fitness test or the combat readiness test or whatever it's called, I think is a good thing for the military. So they're moving in the right direction. So I try not to let perfection be the enemy of the good or like we were talking earlier about optimal, like it's never going to be optimal. Like I try not to let what's optimal interfere with, at least we're doing something better and we're moving in the right direction. And we're at least loading up something that's heavy as shit and asking for a 3 rep max and not a 20 rep max or something else stupid, you know? And so in that regard, it's good. Now back to the second part of your question about accessory work. As a novice, somebody that's new, in order to get stronger, let's say on the bench press, you don't really need to do anything other than bench press. Like just today, I'm going to go in and do 3 sets of 5, and then I'm going to rest a couple days, and then I'm going to go back and do it again, and I'm going to add 5 pounds. All the musculature that is needed to get stronger and get bigger in order to constantly put more weight on the bench press is going to happen just as a function of bench pressing. As a person gets more advanced, simply doing that lift probably won't be enough. Like you will need to implement accessory movements in order to strengthen weak points. For instance, on the bench press, you're probably going to need some specific work to get the pecs bigger, and maybe dumbbell exercises, things like that, in order to get the triceps bigger, in order to get the lats bigger. So you have to, and so simply just, there's a point of diminishing returns of just doing more bench pressing. Like that will work up to a point, and then you will need more work, but it'll also need to be different work, and it'll need to be more focused and isolated in order to yield further and further improvements. So things get a little bit more specialized as one advances, but and the thing is with like a military population, it's, again, I keep going back to athletes, but it's very similar. A lot of those guys are never going to really advance out of the novice or early intermediate phase because they're never going to string together enough consistent training time in order to need advanced level programming. Does that make sense? Because they're going to be constantly interrupted. And every time you have a long interruption, your adaptation to those movements, you become more sensitive. You kind of resensitize. You lose your adaptation to them, and you become resensitized to those movements because you haven't been doing them. So it kind of becomes a situation where it's almost a perpetual cycle of novice to early intermediate programming, have a long interruption of several weeks or several months, and then restart the process again. Get interrupted, restart the process again. Because advanced level programming is needed, in year 1, year 2, year 3, but that is under the assumption that this person is kind of continuously training and not, by definition, an advanced lifter is somebody that is almost a competitor, which means they're not going to have frequent 2-week, 1-month breaks from training, which is the reality of military life. At least when I was in, because of it may be a little different now because there's no real active theaters, at least not in the way that Iraq and
I
Afghanistan.
promise taking out the active combat has only made things less predictable and dumber in garrison.
That doesn't necessarily surprise me. I don't even necessarily have to ask why. I mean, look, being a grunt, being in the infantry, and being in garrison was the worst thing that could ever happen because I was considering re-enlisting, because at the time they were giving out huge bonuses for re-enlistment. And I was like, where are we going to deploy next? And I was hoping they were going to say Afghanistan because I hadn't been there yet. And they said, we're going to Okinawa. And I was like, oh, fuck it, I'm out. Like, no way. Like a year of garrison. And like, I'm out because I know what that means when you're an infantry guy. There's nothing to do. So they come up with stupid shit for you to do. Right. Because it's not like if you're in like some other jobs, if you're a admin guy or, any number of jobs, you have like a 9 to 5, right? You go to work and you do your thing or whatever. And like your role, whether you're in garrison or whether you're deployed is kind of the same. Like it's an ongoing thing. If you're a Navy guy on a ship, like you're always maintaining that part of the ship that that goes on, whether you're parked in the harbor or whether you're underway. Like you always have a job. But in the infantry, unless you're deployed in a combat theater or you're on an actual training op, there's weeks and months at a time where you don't have anything to do, but they're not going to let you just sit around and play Xbox in the barracks. Right. So it becomes cleaning weapons that have already been cleaned 1,000 times or doing any number of other shit that just doesn't make sense. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me that a long time in garrison just makes things worse. But, when I was in, every unit was on a deployment cycle of, every 6 to 8 months, that unit was getting deployed either to Iraq or Afghanistan. And in between, you had to complete a certain number of training ops out in the field. So there just wasn't a lot. I mean, you get a few weeks back in garrison to be at the gym or whatever, and then you're out in the field for 2 weeks, and then you're back for a month, and then you're back out in the field for a couple of weeks, and then you're back for a month, and then you're deployed to Iraq for 8 months. So there was no, like, in a situation like that, you're not going to ever have a guy need advanced level programming because the deployment cycle and the training cycle is just going to interrupt things to such an extent where he's never going to need that level of programming. Now, nowadays, if you're home for 2 years or something and you're not deploying or whatever, you may have enough time in the gym to where more advanced programming becomes necessary. But my guess is enough military guys probably, especially in the infantry side, the regular infantry, but also the special ops world where there's a lot of kind of out in the field training. That's a reality that you have to deal with. It's just, you're out of the gym a lot.
Mm-hmm. Before we let you go, I want to ask you, we've asked this question before as like a closer, just because I'm curious where they sit. But for you specifically, because I've followed you for so long and you've been doing this for so long, it's a two-parter. Number one is, what's something related to barbell training that you've changed your mind on over the years? And then the follow-up is, what's something you've doubled down on?
That's tough.
Yes, nailed it.
Well, the stuff that I've changed my mind on is kind of in the weeds stuff. That may not that be that like for instance, how I train my competitive lifters. I do a lot. I actually just did a Twitter post or X or post or whatever the other day about this of some things that I've changed my mind on or do that I do differently now than I used to. I don't really have anything that I look back on and I'm like, oh, I was just wrong. Like I was just dead wrong on this because, and you see that, and I'll make a broader point about this just for those people that may be listening to this that are getting their content online or whatever. Here's the thing. If somebody that proclaims to be a practitioner of this, in other words, they're an actual coach, they're not just a content creator. Be careful of who you follow because there's people in this space that are just content creators, which basically means they're just marketers. They train themselves, but they train nobody else. They don't own a gym. They don't work at a gym. They don't really take on online clients. Their revenue is generated by YouTube clicks and YouTube ads and, that kind of stuff, merchandise, that sort of thing. Those are content creators. One of the things about content creators is after a certain amount of time, you run out of content and you have to come up with new stuff all the time. Because if you just are like Rip's been saying the same thing for 30 years, but that's because he knows that it works and he's put it into practice with enough people where he's confident in it. So why would he change it if it works? He may update it a little bit to find a more efficient way to do it. And that's the same way with me is that I've been doing it long enough with enough people is I kind of know what works. And so I've updated and revised some things that are kind of marginal in terms of backing off a little bit of volume on this thing, adding a little bit of, but it's all marginal stuff. The thing that you'll find with people that don't really coach people is they'll have a wholesale change of opinion, every few years. Well, I used to do it this way, but I don't do that anymore. I do it this completely different way. Well, it's like, okay, so let's rewind a little bit. In those previous years where you were supporting method A, were you actually seeing people get real results? Because you were really supportive of this for a number of years. And then you just wholesale turned and did a 180 and pivoted to this whole new style. Why would you do that? You know what I'm saying? So they're either doing it for a monetary reason or they were doing it for a monetary reason back then. They were supporting something, but they weren't actually really implementing it and seeing results with it, or they never would have just abandoned it wholesale. It would have been a more moderate kind of evolution. I don't know if that makes sense. I see it all the time because I'm in this as a coach and as a content creator to a degree. So I see that all the time. So for somebody like me that's implementing this stuff all the time, there will be slow evolutions of things that I change in the margins, but my wholesale approach is fundamentally the same because it works. And if it works, you're not going to change it that much. So the thing that I've probably changed the most is like with my strength athletes, I do a lot more singles now, heavy singles, than I used to. I used to do a lot more just sets of 5 all the time on stuff. I do a lot more singles, doubles, and triples now than I used to. And they're not always maximal. So in other words, and again, this is getting down into the weeds, but instead of always doing 3 sets of 5 on a squat. So let's say that's at 80% of 1 rep max. So you're doing 3 sets of 5, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But instead of doing that as much, say 3 sets of 5 at 80%, with like a competitive power lifter, I'm much more likely to do something, say like 5 sets of 3 or 8 sets of 2, but with a higher than average bar speed. So the same amount of volume at the same weight, but doing the sets and reps a little bit differently to elicit a higher power output per rep across that same number of volume. So I do that kind of stuff a lot more with my more advanced athletes than what I used to. So I look now to the basic protocol is the same, but a slight rearrangement of sets and reps to where I focus a lot more on maintaining a fast bar speed, because when bar speed is higher, force output is greater versus when as your reps begin to slow towards that end of that heavy set of 5, there's value in that. But it's also highly fatiguing, and the bar speed goes down. So like for my my more advanced athletes, I do some things differently on how I train the actual competitive lifts. A lot more heavy singles, and then a lot more high, like more sets but less reps per set. So instead of 3 sets of 5, 5 sets of 3, or even 6 or 8 sets of 2, like something like. So I do a lot more of that type of stuff. So again, it's not a fundamental change. It's just kind of some details on the margin of how I may arrange, training volume and that sort of thing. As far as something, what was the other side of it? Something that I've just doubled down on.
Mm-hmm.
Just I
Barbell
I don't.
training.
Yeah, I mean yeah, I mean yes for that. Well, that I will say this: regardless of the goal, regardless of the ultimate goal, whether it is I want to age better, so just for my regular 45-year-old client that is not an athlete, not a competitive lifter, but just wants to, go into his 50s, 60s, and 70s in better shape and not be, wheelchair bound by the time he's 75, or not be able to go on vacations or do all this stuff. So whether that's the goal, kind of a generic general population type goal, or whether it's a guy who's looking to get jacked and more of a physique oriented goal, or whether it's a competitive powerlifter, or whether it's an athlete whose objective is not performance in the gym, kind of like what Alex was talking about a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we're trying to look at increasing performance in the gym, but only as a means to increase performance on the field or wherever. That strength is the foundation for all of those. That regardless of the ultimate goal, that getting stronger is still the foundation, and that's the place that everybody needs to start, and that everybody needs to maintain long term, regardless of, even for an endurance athlete, that's a part of what they should be doing. So for a tactical athlete or a sport athlete, or a guy that wants to get into bodybuilding, or certainly competitive powerlifting, or like you look at CrossFit, you have these interviews with these guys that are these elite level CrossFitters. They don't do CrossFit year round. These guys that go into the CrossFit games and win, they strength train year round in a way that looks more like a powerlifting program and an Olympic weightlifting program, because in order to get good at, say, competing at CrossFit, you need to get really, really strong on the barbell lifts. You need to get really, really strong at the Olympic lifts. And then, kind of like an in-season athlete, as they get closer to that competition, that's when they start implementing a lot of that more sport-specific CrossFit stuff. But for a huge bulk of the year, they're not doing the WODs off of CrossFit.com. That's not how these elite guys train. They are training strength, and they do other conditioning stuff as well. But it's not in a randomized, kind of, we're gonna do a little of this day and a little of this the next day. And that's kind of what CrossFit in its infancy was just a completely randomized set of training events each day, which is not really training. Training
Mm-hmm.
is a progressive, planned out system. And that's how your elite, that's how all your elite athletes train. It's how your elite CrossFitters train. Strength is the foundation of whatever other thing you're going to go. So I always double down on that for people, because people always want to jump to, in the sports world, it's the sports specific stuff. They want to get right into and that's, to me, that's the biggest crock of shit that there ever was, is the sports specific industry, because it doesn't produce a strength adaptation, and it's like, I made a Twitter post about this the other day. It's like, because in baseball, and I train a lot of baseball players too, I don't get how you could, as a coach, or a guy that how could you watch the steroid era unfold back in the 90s and early 2000s, the Mark McGuires and the Sammy Sosas and the Barry Bonds? How could you watch that? And all these guys that were guys like Luis Gonzalez, that were just like journeyman average players, all of a sudden are cranking out 50 home runs a year. How could you watch that unfold and then say strength doesn't matter?
Such a good point.
It's all technique, right? Well, it's like, no, dude. Like, I posted a picture. Like, I don't know how familiar you guys are with baseball, but like,
Yeah.
we have a guy here in Houston on the Astros, got Yordan Alvarez. He's one of the premier power hitters in baseball. And they did a segment on the local TV with him, and he was sitting there like in a t-shirt, and the guy's jacked. I mean, just he's enormous. And I posted a picture of it, I screenshotted it, and I put it up on my Twitter, and I'm like, baseball coaches, it's okay to let your kids get bigger. Like, you know, but they have these kids that they can't squat 185 for a set of 5, but they're doing all this single leg stuff on an inflatable ball, holding a 5-pound dumbbell and doing this rotational stuff with rubber bands. And it's like, this stuff doesn't do anything. Like, you get these kids strong. And then, yeah, maybe for a kid that's already, you know, looks like Sammy Sosa, if you want to have him do some, you know, rotational work with bands or whatever, go ahead. But it goes back to that 2-factor model of get strong, get bigger, and then just practice and play your sport. Like, that is the model for almost every sport that works, is just get strong, in most cases get bigger, and then practice and play your sport. And that will be the best formula. You know, and kind of cycling back to the military world, what does that mean? That I think can pretty much most agree on: get bigger, get stronger, practice and play your sport. What does that mean in the tactical world? Because it's not defined, you know. And that's the crux of the problem, is how do we define what competition is? What is the game day for a soldier, for a Marine infantryman, for a Navy SEAL, for a PJ or whatever? Like, what is game day for that athlete? And it has to be it can't be defined by the training ops. It has to be defined as what is the experience of that, of that soldier or of that Marine or of that sailor. What is the most likely scenario that person is going to encounter in a real world combat scenario, which quite frankly doesn't happen for most military guys. But most military guys are not combat veterans. They're not. And a lot of the leadership is not either. So you don't have a huge sample size of where everybody knows the answer to that question. I would imagine there's a whole lot you guys are still in, but it's been long enough now, I guess, from like the really, the really heavy days of Iraq and Afghanistan, where a lot of that leadership is probably gone. I don't know. Maybe they aren't. Maybe they're still around. But do we have good answers to those questions currently? I don't know. And you don't know what the next war is going to look like. It's likely to not look exactly like Iraq looked or look exactly like Afghanistan looked. It's likely to be something different, and you don't know what that's going to be. So how do you prep for that? It's a hard question to answer.
Mm-hmm. I love the baseball reference. That was beautiful. Well, hey,
but
man,
I'd always say the other answer to that, because people get like, if you say that to parents, like with the minute you say steroids, like they can't hear anything that comes after that. Like, they have an emotional reaction to that. Are you advocating No, I'm not advocating steroids. What I'm saying is if steroids make a difference in your sport, then strength matters. Or else you could take them and it wouldn't matter whether you took them or not. But if it's a banned substance, and if taking them is going to immediately make you better in your sport, then getting stronger is going to help you in that sport. And steroids is just a faster way to get stronger than lifting on a progressive weight training program is. And so I'd say, is there a boys and girls division in your sport? If there is, then strength matters, because that's the only real difference. It is that the men or the boys are stronger, so they're going to run faster, jump higher, hit the ball harder, whatever. It's not that a baseball player swings a bat more beautifully than an elite softball player. They just hit the ball much harder and much further. They can throw the ball much harder and much further. So, and it's not a question of mechanics or skill. It's a question of strength. So if strength matters, then you're going to have a gender segmentation, and steroids are going to be banned. And so that's the way to look at it, of whether strength matters or not. And that's quite frankly the reason a lot of young athletes do turn to steroids, is because their strength and conditioning program is failing them and they're not getting stronger. You have a guy that's at AAA and he's right there on the cusp of getting a major league contract, but he can't quite get the power numbers up. And he's going to this off-season trainer that's got him doing all this one-legged bullshit and cable rotations and all this stuff looks like physical therapy and a circus act combined. He's not getting physically stronger from his training So he's not hitting the ball further. He's not hitting it harder. He's not throwing it faster. So his strength conditioning program is failing him. So his only other alternative is to turn to steroids, and that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I said this in the email when we first started talking, but as a longtime fan of your work, I got to say thank you for coming on. This has been absolute nuggets have been dropped
Good.
tonight. So I think people are going to really love this conversation, man. Thank you.
Sure. I hope it helps somebody.
Oh, I think it'll help plenty. Guys, sometimes we do a podcast episode and it feels like we've just finished up at McDonald's or Chick-fil-A or Burger King because absolute nuggets.
I wasn't sure where that was going.
There we go. And tonight, well, I guess it doesn't have to be tonight, but this week's episode, a lot of nuggets. I should say, I mentioned this a couple of times in the episode. I'll mention it again in the intro, but I've followed Andy Baker's stuff for years. And so to have him be able to speak, I think specifically to a more tactically focused audience was really, really neat. And
Drew talks about speaking to a tactically focused audience stuff, whatever. Drew has a crush. He got to bring his crush.
I got a crush. Yeah, a big crush on Andy Baker. Got to bring him on. Won't be the last time I invite my crushes onto the podcast. Why have a podcast if not to just pursue your crushes? I think that's really why most people started. So,
I'll just check one. I only had one box I had to check for this outro. Nobody's left any podcast reviews in a while. I check occasionally, but a while back we've had almost all extremely positive reviews except for one who gave us 1 star because one of our guests said something that contradicted another one of our guests one time. Like a brigade commander didn't have quite the same opinion on the effectiveness of some physical therapy modality as we did in a research-based episode, whatever. And I got to put this out there. It's okay for people to disagree. That's allowed. Also, every time we bring a guest on, we're not going to necessarily attack them on everything that we may or may not be exactly on the same page as them about. There was tons of goodness in that episode. I think we can all agree on that. Somebody is going to pop out and say, how'd you let him get away with running 3 miles isn't relevant to combat? You guys always talk about aerobic capacity, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. If you bring in Andy Baker on your podcast, you're bringing him on to talk about strength, right? That's what it is. And we talked about strength. Decided not to go down the aerobic capacity rabbit hole and how conditioning for that might help with performance, even on a repeated 300-yard shuttle, whatever. I'm just saying this to get ahead of whoever's going to leave me the annoying review when we get to that point. We still care about aerobic capacity.
Leave the annoying review so we can post it and laugh at people for thinking there's only one.
But for real, leave reviews on the podcast. If you're an Apple person, for sure, leave those reviews. Thanks.
Yeah. No, but I mean, that's a good point. And what's interesting, we didn't get into this with him for this initial conversation, but if you do kind of follow the thread of, he mentioned Bill Starr, and then you get into Mark Ripito starting strength, Andy Baker stuff, you kind of branch off into the barbell logic guys, some of the barbell medicine stuff. You do see some evolution of some of these concepts to address certain things. And I've kind of followed that myself when I think about the starting strength stuff, the practical programming. I would have sworn by that years ago, and I still do to some sense, but I have introduced more auto-regulation. And so maybe that would make me more of a barbell medicine guy. I don't know. But I think one thing is for sure, which is that Andy has made a lot of people very strong for many, many years. And to your point, I think that, sure, there's room for nuance, especially talking about endurance and some of the hybrid things that we mentioned in this episode. But man, if you want to get strong and you want a pretty basic and straightforward way of doing it, this would be where you would want to start. So again, I said at the top, I'll say it at the end. Sometimes you just got to go over to Chick-fil-A and order nuggets.
And before we go, I do want to say a topic we didn't get time to really discuss in depth because the episode kind of went in a different direction. Andy's more recent work has actually been focused. He mentioned it a couple times in passing in the episode, but his more recent work has been focused specifically on older adults and kind of longevity and quality of life focused stuff using barbell training to preserve independence in aging populations and things like that. That's what barbell prescription is all about. So maybe at some point we'll bring it back and talk about that, or just go check out the book. Tons of goodness there. Hugely relevant. And even in uniform, I was just thinking about this with all the AUSA stuff.
Colonels, all you old colonels out there trying to live longer.
During the H2F talk at AUSA, somebody asked General Mingus, like, what part of the data convinced him that H2F was worth investing in on a large scale. And he was candid, and I appreciated this answer. He said it wasn't the data. Like, the data helps, but it wasn't the data that convinced me. He just believes because he's experienced it through Ranger Athlete Warrior and things like that. And I think that's real. And I think that's how senior leaders make decisions if we're being realistic about it. And so that means part of the game, like if you're a practitioner out there, part of the game of this whole thing is like the people who make the resource decisions are like colonels and generals. And that means they're like probably 45 or older. And you might want to have some knowledge, even if you're purely in a tactical world, but like maybe if you're just a human who wants to live past 45, might be good to have some knowledge on the relevance of this kind of training for that population. That's all.
Boom. So yeah, thanks again for tuning in. Please leave all your hate-filled reviews on the platform of your choice. And yeah, we'll see you guys next week. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.